second or third, depending on the source, largest athletic event in the world, and a thing that I feel vaguely obligated to care about as a disabled person, but also I really don't like sports to begin with, and also don't really know anything about the Paralympic Games, because, well, the Olympics are a thing that you have playing in the background as you make dinner or try to pretend you're getting your algebra homework done, and by the time the Paralympics rolls around, you're kind of just sportsed out. Not to mention the amount of inspiration porn surrounding all of the coverage of the Paralympics, and it's just truly nauseating. But anyway, the opening ceremonies to the Paralympics are this Friday, and so I figured that, well, maybe I should at least try to vaguely understand it this year, or at least learn something about it so that I can make an educated decision whether I actually want to care about them or not, rather than the general, I get weird vibes and I don't feel right about this. And the best motivation for deep researching something and learning about a thing, well, that is to teach somebody else. So hello, welcome. Today we are going to learn about all of the ins and outs of the Paralympics. The history, the how it works bit, the Deaf and the Special Olympics, and a whole host of issues that come along with all of them. Cause oh boy, there are many. Oh man, to the point where I actually got very deeply interested in this despite not caring at all about sports. So you know it has to be at least very bad, if not very, very bad. Now, if you're new here, hello, I haven't introduced myself in a while. My name is Sydney, I use she/her pronouns, I am physically disabled, chronically ill, autistic, all of which are in the disabled category, and I'm also a queer college student who uses this space to educate you all about neuroscience, disability, and neurodivergency stuff, and anything else that brings me joy, as well as, to remind myself that I am a smart and capable and functional human being despite what the soul-crushing school system likes to make me believe on a daily basis. That was dark. I also dress like an off-brand Disney princess, and I'm a service dog trainer. So if any of those things bring you some level of joy or interest you, etc., you're welcome to subscribe and join my little corner of the internet. I'm very happy to have you here, but also no pressure, you do you. Anyway, sports. We're talking about sports. Yeah. So the history of the Paralympics. So most histories of the Paralympics that you read start just after World War II, and that is because that's when the able-bodied people came up with the idea of disabled competition sports. But the real history actually starts in the late 1800s. So early sports competitions for disabled people, very early ones, more closely resembled freak shows than actual serious sporting events, because that's history for you. But in the early 1900s, we took control and started to create our own sporting events. For example, in 1924 in Paris, the World Games for the Deaf began, and they were planned, run, and competed in entirely by deaf people. Also, during World War II, when men went to the front and women started working in factories, this is also when a lot of deaf people started to work in the factories as well, and specifically in a large group in Akron, Ohio. Akron? I don't know. They organized their own official deaf sporting events on their days off, and this kind of combined with the World Games for the Deaf and became what we now know as the Deaf Olympics, which does still happen every 2 years like the regular Olympics, though it's on the off year for some reason. And it's recognized by the International Olympic Committee, and yes, you are probably learning about this now for the very first time, so that's really cool. So anyway, the official Paralympic history, give or take, began in 1944 when Dr. Ludwig Guttmann opened a spinal cord injury center for war veterans at the Stoke Mandeville Hospital in the UK. He firmly believed that exercise and sport are an important part of rehabilitation, so he introduced them as part of his treatment program. And over time, it expanded from just rehabilitation requirements to recreational games for fun. So in July of 1948, Dr. Guttmann decided to launch the Stoke Mandeville Games on the same day as the opening ceremonies for the 1948 London Olympics. It was an archery competition for 16 wheelchair-using veterans and was actually the first organized competition for athlete wheelchair users, which is really cool. 4 years later, in 1952, the International Stoke Mandeville Games were founded, and the first country to send athletes was the Netherlands. 8 years after that, in 1960, the first Paralympic Games were held in Rome, though they were named Paralympics retroactively, and it was the first time non-veterans took part in the Games. There were 400 athletes from 23 nations, all of them wheelchair users, and from then on the Games started to occur every 4 years. The Special Olympics were created in 1968 for people with intellectual disabilities, and first I was supremely grossed out by the fact that they used the word special in their title. But then I actually discovered there's quite an interesting history behind this. So they're created by Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who is the sister of JFK, and she married Sargent Shriver, who you may remember, this super cool guy from my eugenics video. He started Vista and Head Start, and the Job Corps was a big part of the Peace Corps, etc. Super great guy. And she founded these games in honor of her sister, Rosemary Kennedy, who was intellectually disabled and loved sports until she was given a lobotomy and couldn't really do them anymore. That whole story is super sad, but it's a very important one in disabled history. I'm not going to go into it here because we don't have time, but I will include a video about it in the description if you want to learn more about her story. But anyway, Eunice chose to use the word special here because the only classification word that was really used widely for intellectually disabled people at the time was retarded, which is a slur. That's the second time that I've ever said it out loud, and I really hated that. Now, I do think that the name could and probably should be changed, but I also get that that's not going to happen really ever, probably because of the amount of publicity and whatever that already exists. But anyway, these games are set up similarly to the Paralympics with their disability categorizations, and we'll get there. Don't you worry, that's a whole thing. And the World Games are on alternate years like the Deaflympics are. Now, I was personally really confused while I was researching this because everything everywhere says that Special Olympics happen 365 days a year all over the world, and to be a Special Olympic athlete, you must be at least 8 years old and have a diagnosed intellectual disability, and that's all I could find. And I was like, that's not an Olympics? But then I discovered that I had been reading about the Special Olympics as an organization rather than specifically the Special Olympics World Games, which are the World Games. However, it is still a little different from the Olympics and the Paralympics because rather than being the top 5 fastest or the top 5 best athletes in a category or whatever, world-class Special Olympic athletes send in applications to be on the Special Olympics World Games team, and then they are chosen at random. I don't think it's totally at random. They're chosen to participate. Back to the history. So these games started in 1968, and then in 1976, the first Winter Paralympic Games began in Sweden, in addition to the Summer Games in Toronto. This was also the first time that non-wheelchair users were included in the games. Also, this isn't entirely relevant to this, but in 1986, the Winter and Summer Games began alternating so that there were games every 2 years rather than having everything every 4 to boost ratings. That was genuinely the reason behind it. In 1988, this was the first time the Paralympics took place in the same city where the Olympics were being held, which was in Seoul, South Korea. These 1988 games were also the first time that the term Paralympic was used, deriving from the Greek para, meaning beside or alongside, and the word Olympic, obviously. Now, it was meant to show how the Olympics and Paralympics exist together and draw parallels between the two games. In 1996, athletes with intellectual disabilities were included in the Paralympics for the first time. However, at the 2000 Summer Games in Sydney, there was a huge cheating scandal that resulted in the blanket ban of intellectually disabled athletic events until London 2012, although there are significantly less events for intellectually disabled people now than there were before the scandal. Also, if you're thinking, fine, but can't they just do the Special Olympics? I don't get why they're in both Olympics. Keep in mind that the Paralympics are a rank thing and the Special Olympics are the application process, so it's super different. Anyway, the in-depth details of the scandal don't really majorly matter to the topic at hand, so we're just not going to go over them in this video, and I'll link some in the description if you want to read it. I'm just kidding, we all know this became a minor special interest that I researched for 3 days straight. Let's do a mini info dump. So basically, the men's intellectually disabled basketball team from Spain for the Paralympic Games in Sydney 2000, I wrote 2020, had 12 members because apparently that's how basketball works, and 10 of those 12 members, 10, were not intellectually disabled. And when I first read about this, I was like, well, maybe it's just because the classification process for the Paralympics is really messy and they were disabled, but not to the level they said they were, or they got in the wrong category by accident or whatever, because I always like to have hope in humanity and hope that people mean well. But no, truly 10 non-disabled current and former collegiate basketball players were recruited from around the country and placed on the team with only 2 actually intellectually disabled teammates who could tell that something was weird, but nobody listened to them try to express that. Supposedly there is an IQ test requirement for participation, which I have issues with in its own right, because IQ tests are a whole mess, but that these players would have had to strategically do well enough to make it seem natural, but bad enough to qualify as intellectually disabled, which is very difficult to do. But they were actually just given forged paperwork, so as far as we know from some of the players that have been interviewed, they didn't really have to go through any vetting process. And several officials along the way were actually a little bit suspicious, but nobody listened to them either, or they just didn't bother to say anything because they knew that they wouldn't be listened to. So that's good. Now this team went to the games, absolutely crushed all the other teams, obviously, and wins gold. But then, plot twist, one of the abled members of the team was actually an undercover investigative journalist. So a few weeks after the game, he decided to mail back his medal, team kit, and the prize money, and he told the Paralympic Committee that his team had cheated. There was a lot of finger pointing, a lot of theories that many other teams were also very probably cheating, though we don't have direct proof of that. And everything got really gross and messy, ultimately causing a blanket ban on intellectually disabled sports until they could figure out how to strengthen their criteria and prevent this from ever happening again. The impacts of this whole scandal were and are widespread. Even though it happened before I was born, we are still seeing so many ramifications. Obviously, the major one is that intellectually disabled athletes missed out on over a decade of Paralympic Games, and still a lot of the sports that formerly had intellectually disabled participants don't anymore. And so many competition sports leagues for disabled people, even local and school-based small competitions, removed these categories from their competitions as well, meaning that not only did this ruin the careers of the Paralympians meant to compete in that decade of time, but also the next generation trying to make a name for themselves in their sports in order to one day get to the Paralympic Games. An intellectually disabled swimmer who had his career destroyed because of the situation made a really incredible podcast called The Fake Paralympians. It's 6 episodes. I highly recommend it, and I've linked it in the description for you as well. Another heartbreaking impact of this is that the 2 actually intellectually disabled people on this team were called in for questioning and to testify and whatnot, and they weren't given adequate support or accommodation, so they didn't actually quite understand what was going on or what they were being asked, and they had to give up their gold medals too, even though it wasn't their fault. Now, beyond the sports world, this was such a big story and such a scandal that practically the whole world heard about it, and that promoted the stereotype that disabled people are just faking it to get ahead for benefits or clout or whatever, which was already a pervasive idea, but now is so much more so. It's both completely heartbreaking and also a very interesting case study into humanity and psychology as a whole. But now, as we're talking about cheating in the Paralympic Games, I also want to say that doping is actually an issue here too, which kind of surprised me, but it's a lot more complicated than in the traditional Olympics, because what we see as performance-enhancing drugs are also regular treatments for disabilities and chronic illnesses, so it's really hard to police who is using these for performance-enhancing, who's using them to just survive. There's also this thing called boosting, which is mostly with athletes with paralysis, where they put extreme compression on one of the paralyzed limbs to spike their blood pressure, and obviously it causes bodily harm, but they can't feel it, so to them it doesn't really matter. But anyway, we're gonna move on. Let's talk about the structure of the Paralympic Games. So the Winter Games have 6 sports and typically about 800 athletes of late, while the Summer Games have 22 sports and typically about 4,000 athletes. And some sports are only held for certain disability types. Now, the way that they classify disabilities used to be very strictly by medical evaluation and a diagnosis of impairment, but now the focus is more on what effect the athlete's impairment has on their athletic performance. For example, regardless of the reason a person cannot use their legs at all, they tend to all compete together in a wheelchair division. And this categorization process is in order to make sure that the playing field is fair, because obviously a blind swimmer and a swimmer without legs are going to have very different impairments in the pool and can't really fairly race against each other. Now, when it comes to creating a team, like for basketball or rugby or something else, members of the team are each given a point value based on their activity limitation levels. And the less points you have, the more severe activity limitation, than having a higher score. And each team cannot have more than a certain maximum point total on the field at the same time to ensure that there is equal competition. There are 10 major categories of impairments in the Paralympic Games. Most of these are phrased slightly differently depending on the source that you go to. So if you read something that's different from this, sorry. Also, each of the 10 categories is then broken up into further subcategories. As far as I can tell, there are at least 60 different disability classes. I genuinely got super lost at this point and I really couldn't figure out what was going on, but I figured it wasn't majorly important and you can just get the idea from this. I hope you don't mind me not knowing all of the intricacies of disabled sport classifications. Hopefully you get the idea from this. The 10 categories are impaired muscle power, which means that the force generated by muscles is reduced. So that's typically spinal cord injury, spina bifida, post-polio syndrome, etc. Then we have impaired passive range of movement, which is when the range of movement in one or more joints is reduced in a systematic way, like for example with arthrogryposis. This does not include acute conditions like arthritis or hypermobilities. Next category is limb deficiency, categorized as a total or partial absence of bones or joints as a consequence of trauma, so for example traumatic amputation, illness, example bone cancer, or congenital limb deficiency. example, dysmelia. Then we have leg length difference, which is a bone shortening in one leg due to congenital deficiency or trauma. Then short stature, which is reduced standing height due to atypical dimensions of bones of upper and lower limbs or trunk, for example, due to achondroplasia or growth hormone dysfunction. Then hypertonia, which is an atypical increase in muscle tension and a reduced ability of a muscle to stretch, which can result from injury or illness, such as cerebral palsy. Also, most of the official descriptions include the word abnormal or deficient. I'm trying really hard not to use those words, but if I do so by accident somewhere in this video because of where I pulled the quote from, I'm truly sorry. I really don't like this medical terminology, forgive me. Now the next category is ataxia, or a lack of coordination of muscle movements due to a neurological condition such as cerebral palsy, brain injury, or MS. Then athetosis, generally characterized by unbalanced involuntary movements and a difficulty in maintaining a symmetrical posture due to cerebral palsy, brain injury, MS, or other conditions. Then we have visual impairment, where the vision is impacted by either an impairment of the eye structure or optical nerve pathways or the visual cortex. And this one specifically is typically recognized as 3 different grades of impairment, and therefore all competitors in the visually impaired category must wear a visor or a blackout mask so that athletes with less visual impairment will not have an advantage over the others. And lastly, we have intellectual impairment, which is categorized as a limitation in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical adaptive skills, which originates before the age of 18. You also may notice that some of these have overlaps. Some people with the same conditions could be in several different categories at once. I don't quite know how that works because I don't know the intricacies of how disabled sports are divided up, and they couldn't figure it out by all the charts that I read. So if you have more explanation than that, please drop it in the comments. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what's going on here. Now, what are the issues with this? Probably that might be one of them. So the first and very clear one is that the Paralympics claim to be all about accepting the social model of disability and emancipating disabled people from their medical labels and diagnoses and not categorizing them. And then their own classification is so deeply rooted in the oppressive medical systems that they claim to conquer that are categorizing them. And it continues to reinforce this hierarchy of who is more or less disabled, and that's very disempowering to see. Also, only a narrow range of disabilities are actually considered in this, so you're very unlikely to see your own disability represented at the Paralympics. And these classifications are also always changing. One story that I read somewhere that really stuck with me was a British wheelchair basketballer named Oscar Knight, and he is a wheelchair user obviously, but his chronic pain condition is not listed as eligible by the IPC classification, so he can't play. And he, like many others in similar positions, has genuinely considered amputation of a limb in order to comply with the classification system so that he can still participate. Like, I'm sorry. What? Just let that sink in for a second. Now, there's also been a lot of criticism about how these classifications favor athletes with less severe impairments, particularly ones that can be technologically enhanced through really cool prosthetics. And research has actually shown that since the games have been streamed more widely across the world, people are more likely to associate disability with technologically enhanced individuals. And it even has a term. It's called the cyborgification of the Paralympics. And there are very legitimate fears that this is just a way to produce a marketable product, to make the games kind of palatable to the non-disabled viewers by excluding the more severely and complexly and messily disabled people from participating in the games, even though they were initially created for those people. Not to mention that this kind of cyborgy technology is prohibitively expensive, and for people with more complex disabilities, often not even an option to begin with, which removes even more possibilities of disabled viewers seeing role models in these games. There's also a growing criticism that the games still might not be fair to all athletes. For example, an athlete who's running a race with a left prosthetic leg may be disadvantaged compared to one with a right side prosthesis because, well, the races are run in an anti-clockwise anti-clockwise direction, giving some athletes an advantage. But also there kind of comes a point when there would be so many little groups existing that would winning in a specific category really prove anything? Because like the idea of the Olympics is like, find the best person in the world at this one thing. And you could argue that maybe we should categorize pieces of the Olympics into classes too. I mean, if we consider being really tall to be a disability because it is disabling in some situations, should we separate them from less massively tall people for an equal playing field? And while that may seem absurd, we're kind of already doing that with gender in sports, and then that ties into the whole trans people in sports thing, which really shouldn't need to be as big of a problem as the world is making it to be. Like, it's a sport. It's a social thing. Sports are a social thing to begin with. Just let people do the sport as they identify. Nothing is really fair anywhere anyway because, every human is different in some manner and has strengths and weaknesses, so where do we draw the lines here? Also, there comes a point, like I mentioned, after dividing and dividing and dividing, where you have so many little groups that winning in any category doesn't really prove that you're the best in the world. But then at the same time, I also don't think that it's fair to have a disabled athlete compete alongside with a non-disabled athlete in the same competition. So the whole thing's just an icky, gross mess that I don't know how to deal with because there really isn't a way to fix it. Speaking about icky mess, let's talk about how the Paralympics don't really help the disability rights movement. Yeah, you did hear that sentence right. Because turns out the reason that they make me feel really gross and icky is not just a me issue. It's actually a very valid and logical thing backed up by actual numbers and actual research. So let us start with a quote that I did not write down where I got it from, and I also read approximately 50 different articles, watched 10 different videos, and listened to a 6-episode podcast for this video, so I will never find where it came from again. The stated vision of the IPC is to create a more inclusive society through the Paralympic Games. But can an elite sporting event that lasts 2 weeks every 4 years really achieve meaningful social change? And you know what? Let's start with the positives. It is making some host countries go, oh wait, we weren't accessible at all, and then actually make some major infrastructure changes. Sometimes. Also, that's literally just a very small subsection of change being made. They usually only fix it in the one city where they host the Olympics and then don't do anything across the country. The major issue is that the International Paralympic Committee claims that their organization and the work that they're doing is creating an inclusive society when they're literally just subcategorizing and comparing disability in a very harmful and hurtful way. And while it is great for disabled people because we do deserve equal rights and access to all things, it's overshadowed by the sickening amount of paternalism and inspiration porn that comes in the coverage of these games. And this leads people to go, well, we have this for them, so disability rights aren't an issue, in the same way that a lot of Americans claimed that racism was over because we had one black president once. That's simply not how that works. So let's start with the elite thing. People with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty and have a hard time finding jobs. And that means that additional entrance fees into athletic facilities for somebody's necessary carer, or a $5,000 basketball wheelchair, or a $10,000 set of prosthetic legs, on top of all the medical bills of just being disabled and trying to get mobility aids, are just not options to begin with. There's also the added knowledge that not all countries even offer any disability support, so it makes it very hard for many countries to even send athletes to the games. There's also been discussion in the realm of the Paralympic cyborgification situation that there is a clear divide amongst developed and developing nations in the games because of this class distinction here. Also, most sports are entirely inaccessible, and making an elite sport more accessible while still keeping the 200 plus barriers that disabled people have to face to do physical activity in every other part of the sports world, that's a serious issue. And that number isn't made up, that's from research. And we also have an infinitely greater risk of developing further chronic diseases on top of our disabilities because of how impossible it is to exercise. Public playgrounds, swimming pools, and outdoor tracks are typically entirely inaccessible to wheelchair users. Fitness and rec centers claiming to be accessible often don't even have accessible changing rooms or showers or even clear pathways to be able to move about. Not to mention that public transportation is rarely accessible, meaning that we can't even get there to begin with. And yeah, I make a lot of jokes about how I don't care about sports and I don't know what's going on in the sports world, but that's kind of only because it's so much easier to just ignore a thing that I will never be able to safely do and tell people that I can't, rather than put my energy into reminding myself how disabled I am and potentially put myself in a dangerous position by doing sports. I adore archery and I'm quite good at it. In fact, I used to teach it, but I can't do more than 3 rounds at once, so I'm not gonna pay to shoot for an hour at some expensive fancy place where I would spend 45 minutes of that hour sitting around doing nothing and watching other people and feeling bad about myself. I also love to hike, but I struggle with steep inclines, so I only hike when I plan that hike myself because other people don't think about my needs. I love dancing, but I've always told myself I was bad at it because things were never explained in a way that I understood, and in classes or dance calls you can't really take any breaks or you just get super behind. And once I fixed those 2 things with maybe 8 hours of intensive work for one project, I was able to come up with an incredible dance music video, and I'm really proud of it. But I couldn't do that in a regular dance setting. I also, believe it or not, used to actually train for a swim team, and I could swim 500 meters no problem until I had to start doing the butterfly stroke, which made me really woozy in the water because of how much of the up and down it was, so then I wasn't allowed to swim laps anymore even though all of my other strokes were perfectly fine. We're told that since the Paralympics exist, there isn't really an issue with inaccessible sports, but that's blatantly not true. Teachers and coaches aren't taught to understand or handle disability on the court or on the field or whatever, and they're, at least in my experience, really scared of it. And when you're in a space where you can do stuff without a teacher or a coach, that's usually not accessible either, because you can't even get there, and that is just infuriating. And I say this as somebody who can easily pass as able-bodied, and I don't typically have mobility issues, so I can only imagine how difficult it is for others. The Paralympic Committee has also made it clear in other ways how out of touch they are with the disability community. You may remember the story of Becca Myers, a deafblind 3-time gold medal winner in swimming who had to withdraw from the Tokyo Paralympics because, due to COVID restrictions, they denied her personal care assistant. Also, the fact that they intended to hold the games at all during a spike in worldwide COVID cases, I believe it was during the Delta variant, for a community that is disproportionately affected by this pandemic due to the higher risk levels, increased inaccessibility, and lack of care access, really shows how much they don't put the well-being of their athletes first. And this brings us into the idea of tokenism, because it's rampant in these games. Politicians post about their support of the Paralympic athletes to make themselves feel better, but then at the same time spend every other part of the year openly discriminating against and denying us our legal rights. And we've seen this time and time again, year after year, of host nations saying, we have equality for disabled people, we hosted the Paralympics, and then use that rhetoric to continuously silence the actually disabled community in those countries. In fact, you'll notice a very significant gap between the Paralympics and the disability community and disability rights movement as a whole. Like, really significant. And that's because we know that this tokenization happens. We see how the achievements of our disabled peers are used for the purposes of propaganda. We see how inspiration porn-led narratives are shaped around these people, whether they want those or not, and how everybody calls them heroes, and how they defied all of the odds, etc. And because of this narrative that the Paralympics are the only way to really be a successful disabled person, and that the athletes in the game have to endure so much ableism on a daily basis, I know for a fact that there are some disabled athletes who subscribe to this, and they support it, and they don't like having disabled as part of their identity. And that's valid, and I get it, and I've been there, and you're allowed to feel that way. But also, it is so hard to try and feel kinship to my peers when every time a microphone is put near them, I hold my breath hoping that they don't say something offensive or harmful for other people like me. And also, I don't know how much of that is truly how they think and feel, or how the media has edited and portrayed this narrative to seem because it fits into that ableist lens. It all just feels so sanitized and marketable, and not the beautifully messy disabled community that I have known and come to love. Like, even though I do feel a wee bit empowered, I'm not gonna lie, I'm always just left feeling a little weird. Like something's just off. And we'll get to that in a bit. There's also a massive gap between how the general public perceives Paralympians and how they perceive the rest of the disability community. Because if Paralympians are so successful, then why aren't we? Because they don't realize how much of a very tiny subgroup Paralympians are of the wider population of about 1 billion disabled people. Also, it's really important to realize that, to quote 3-time Paralympic equestrian gold medalist Sophie Christensen, it is assumed that because I am at the top of my sport and won 3 gold medals, my life is sorted out. But I still have problems receiving the right care I need for cerebral palsy. I still have to raise money to pay for carers, and I have trouble finding them. So while the Paralympics push this whole narrative that you're either a superhero overcoming your disability and achieving great things, or a scrounger whose failure to overcome your disability makes you a lazy drain on society, and the numbers prove this isn't just a theory, these people that we idolize as overcoming their disability still can't afford their own basic care. Like, yeah, the Paralympic Games are a huge, huge achievement, but just like the Olympics aren't the reality of life for, like, regular people, the Paralympics aren't the reality of life for disabled people, but for some reason, people can't see that. And it feels kind of like we can't celebrate our peers because every time it feels more and more like a spectacle of the acceptable disabled people to make non-disabled people feel better about themselves by watching it. And now, speaking of bad narratives, let's go through some ad campaigns related to the Paralympics, because they're fun. So generally, they all follow this same sort of inspiration porn structure, and if you haven't seen my inspiration porn video, you can watch it up here. This is my left, yeah, you can watch it up here. But basic definition is the portrayal of people with disabilities as being inspirational to able-bodied people, on the basis of their disability. Like the fact that I get up every morning and get dressed and go to school despite the hardships that are in my way because of my debilitating disabilities is just so inspiring to you, and you admire my bravery for just living my life when I have literally no other choice. A meta-analysis of Paralympic advertisements showed that they show athletes in passive poses much more frequently than they do in active ones, and focus more on the impairment rather than the athlete's actual sporting ability, dehumanizing them to make them palatable idols and heroes who have beaten the odds or defied belief. And this has, on some level, changed people's opinions of disability. That is true, and we can see that in the numbers, but they also strengthen stereotypes about us too. So let's look specifically at the 2012 London ad campaign. It used the catchphrase, "Meet the superhumans." Let's start with a quote from a disabled journalist named Lucy Catchpole. "Creating a view of disabled people as magical creatures who might look impaired but actually, ta-da, are as capable as everyone else, if not more so, #superhumans, means that the general public will find the vast majority of disabled people with our pain and our weakness and fatigue even more frustrating and confounding than they already do." And now I went and watched some clips from that campaign, and they, again, left for me the emotional version of that thing when you eat something too sweet and then promptly feel the need to brush your teeth like 12 times to, get back to a basis. Something just felt kind of wrong. And then I went into the comment section and I saw so many things like, "That's a level of strength I can only dream of," or like, "There are real heroes," and lots of stuff that is well-meaning, but also clearly shows that you don't care about us or see us as human beings, or even see our struggles at all. You just like to look at how we've overcome them, tell yourself that all of us as disabled people just need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps to get to that point, and ignore all of the systemic issues that you're propagating by pretending that these issues don't exist. And it really reinforces the low expectations society has for us. The fact that you call us brave for just getting out of bed in the morning is a serious issue, and you don't really see that. Boris Johnson responded to this campaign by saying that this really inspires disabled kids too. And I will say on one level, yeah, it kind of does. To see somebody like you on a screen succeeding and being happy and loved while also having a disability does genuinely mean something. But also, as we spoke about before, most disabled kids won't see that as somebody like them. Also, not every disabled kid is sporty, whether that's because they simply aren't interested, or like I mentioned about myself earlier, it's so inaccessible to them that they don't even bother trying to have interest. So why are we only striving to inspire disabled athletes and not disabled scientists and doctors and architects and engineers and actors and writers and artists and lawyers and literally every other career that's out there? Also, research has shown that it doesn't inspire disabled people to get up and go try a sport, because the sports aren't accessible to us to begin with. If we were interested, we kind of would have already tried. But you just keep saying that it's doing something, and maybe you'll believe it for yourself, so you don't have to actually do any work to make any social change to include us in these things. For Rio 2016, the campaign was #YesICan, which, again, yeah, you can do anything you put your mind to, but if you keep coming up with barrier after barrier after barrier along the way, you're going to burn out pretty quickly, and you're not going to get very far, and very few will get very far. But by saying that these people just believed and so they did it, you're ignoring all of the social and systemic barriers that often prevent disabled people from actually being active. Tokyo 2020's campaign was We the 15, which I will say was a lot more nuanced, and I did appreciate that, but also it was launched in the middle of a pandemic where millions of disabled people were needlessly dying due to political inaction and lack of care for our lives and well-being. But anyway, I digress. So the first issue with this campaign is that it pledged to educate people about disability and the disability community, and that it used person-first language in all of their launch stuff, and also failed to put alt text on any of the images. So clearly they care so much about the disability community and our needs. Obviously, absolutely, yeah. And while everybody in the wider world was praising this new campaign for their cool ads, which were a significant improvement, I will say, and talking about how this time it'll make real change in the community, the disability community was like, no, that's not going to happen. We don't buy it. I mean, you can share hashtags and infographics all that you want, and you can continuously say disabled people are human beings like we are, but that is so artificial, and it doesn't mean that you're doing the work. It means that you're telling yourself that you are, feeling really great about yourself, and then never thinking about the disability community again. And guess what? That's precisely what happened with this campaign. We watched it happen, and we've seen this happen over and over and over again as disabled communities, as any other minority community. And at the end of the day, what I learned at least is that I did feel icky for a good reason. Not because the Paralympics are inherently bad, because I don't think they are. I am all here for disabled sports. But because these games are used as weapons against the disabled community. Because they're a sanitized version of what disability truly is. And because it has such a shiny, glossy cover, the only people who see through that are the disability community. And then we're told over and over and over again that, no, it's positive, it's a triumph, and we should be grateful for it. And we're left feeling confused and wrong and icky. And when I was talking to all my friends about this, trying to figure out how to properly explain what this weird feeling is, I realized it's what gaslighting feels like. That's what it is. It's going, hey, this is discrimination, and everyone else going, no, it can't be. Look how positive and happy it is. And I think that all of that, all of the politicization of the whole thing overshadows the sheer awesomeness of the Paralympics. Because while they're supposed to be made for people like me, I feel excluded from them. And that's the vibe that I get from all of my other disabled peers too. And like, on one level, I fully agree that we should not have disabled athletes going head-to-head with non-disabled athletes, because clearly that's not fair, but at the same time I take serious issue with all of this division and classification and whatnot within an event like the Olympics that began as a way to connect all of the Greek city-states together with Zeus. And while they've become a lot more politicized now, and by now I mean like the last 100 years or so, I still feel like a huge part of the point of the Olympics is uniting the whole world together to essentially play games. So it feels very anti-Olympian to have everything splintered and separated and corrupt and categorized. Because I guess while that does ensure a fair playing field, it also doesn't feel very unifying to me. And I don't know where I was going with that. I guess that's probably how all sports work. There's corruption everywhere. I don't know, just some musings. But all in all, I think that we can and should support our disabled peers. Because regardless of how much of a disaster the system is, they're still there, and they're still doing some athletic stuff that I could and should never even try to do. Also, I came upon a really great article in my research about how the Tokyo Paralympics had 34 out queer disabled people, 3 of them non-binary, and 2 of them which were married to each other, so extra love to our queer Paralympians. And it's also really cool to actually be able to watch sports that would normally not be on any channels anywhere. And I do think that the ideas of, yeah, I can do whatever I want and put my mind to, and yeah, there are barriers in my way, but if I want to break them down, I'm gonna try my dang hardest to do that. Those are really valuable ideas because it does take so much extra effort to get to the same level as a disabled person. And I wish that that would be recognized more. But also, I'm very tired of being told that my disabilities are a tragedy and that the world will be infinitely harder for me now, and how it's so inspiring how I go and I face it and I fight it every day, rather than, I don't know, actually doing something about it so that it's not an infinitely harder situation for me. Because if you want to talk about how you see our strength and our bravery or whatever, you better be disabled yourself and understand that experience, or showing that you're really doing something to actually change the system. Because otherwise, you're just placating your own conscience in a way that dehumanizes me and all of my disabled siblings. And that's, in short, how the Paralympics works. So, in conclusion, go team, do the thing, score the point, woo. And to everybody on the sidelines, please think more critically about what these games mean to you, why you watch them, what biases you may hold, and what kinds of things you might need to learn a little bit more about. Because, I mean, the Paralympic Committee claims that that's what they're making you do, so for their sake, you should at least try. Anyway, who knew I could go on for however long this video is about sports? I'm both surprised and amazed that I ended up genuinely finding this interesting. Turns out I've felt icky and ambivalent about the Paralympics for my whole life for pretty much good reason. And I'm sending all of my love to our Paralympians, regardless of what country they represent. I hope you have fun. I'm a theater kid. I don't know what you're supposed to say to an Olympian. Also, you're not watching my video. If you are, hi, hello. But anyway, to the rest of y'all, as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, your story isn't over, it has only just begun. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.